They thought they were the hunters. But the first explosion told them the truth. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, the corridors were silent, calm, almost peaceful. Officers moved with quiet confidence, sailors joked softly, and the ocean glittered like polished steel beneath the rising sun. To every man on that ship, victory felt guaranteed. Midway was supposed to be the final blow, the strike that would end America's carrier force forever. Inside the planning room, maps were neatly arranged, attack orders meticulously laid out. Admiral Nagamo stood over them, hands behind his back, the faintest smile on his face. "By this time tomorrow," he murmured, "America will have no fleet left." But just outside that door, a wireless operator sat frozen in his chair. He stared at his radio set, listening to static mixed with faint scattered transmissions. They were too clean, too deliberate, too sharp to be random American noise. He hesitated. Should he report it? Should he interrupt the Admiral's confidence? He didn't, and that silence would soon cost Japan everything. As dawn broke, a scout plane reported back. No American carriers sighted. Laughter filled the room. Officers relaxed. Some even celebrated quietly, but the report was wrong. One scout plane assigned to search the most important sector had never launched. That empty slice of ocean now hid something massive, something silent, something waiting. 3 American carriers. But no one on Akagi knew that yet. Then, just after 7 a.m., a shadow rolled across the horizon. First, a few men thought it was weather. A drifting cloud bank, maybe, but clouds don't move like that. Clouds don't hum. A Japanese spotter suddenly shouted from the mast, "Aircraft! Dozens! Approaching from the east." East? That was impossible. Midway Island was to the west. Japan's fleet was to the north. No American aircraft should be coming from the east, unless America already knew the attack plan. Unless the entire operation was compromised. Lieutenant Tomio Kaku grabbed his binoculars. He saw torpedo planes, then dive bombers, then more torpedo planes behind him. Not chaos, not desperation. A sequence, a coordinated trap. His heart stopped. "They were waiting for us," he whispered. He didn't wait for permission. He sprinted to the Admiral's room, boots slamming the steel floor, breath shaking, knowing each second mattered. He burst inside, saluted sharply, and forced the words out. "Admiral." "It's a trap!" The room fell silent. Nagamo turned slowly, his face pale, eyes wide not with anger, but with the dawning terror that everything he believed was collapsing. "They know," the officer continued, voice cracking. "They know everything." And outside, growing louder, came the low, rising scream of American dive bombers. Nagamo looked toward the ceiling, toward the sound that would decide the fate of the Pacific. "Impossible," he whispered. But it was already too late. The first bomb didn't fall on Akagi. It fell close enough to make the entire ship tremble. Men froze where they stood. Papers fluttered off tables, coffee cups slid across desks, and for a moment, no one breathed. Then the second bomb hit the ocean closer. Much closer. Nagamo felt the vibration through the steel floor. He looked at his officers, at the fear flashing in their eyes, and finally understood something he had refused to accept. The Americans weren't surprised. They were prepared. He rushed to the command deck, stepping into chaos. Alarms wailed. Sailors ran in every direction. Anti-air guns roared to life, their barrels blazing at the sky. A wave of American torpedo planes skimmed over the water, flying so low their wings almost touched the waves. They came straight toward the Japanese carriers, slow, vulnerable, but relentless. Japanese gunners opened fire. Shells burst around the incoming planes. One American torpedo bomber exploded in a fireball, then another, then another. Officers cheered, but the cheers died immediately when they saw something terrifying. The torpedo planes weren't attacking to sink the fleet. They were attacking to force the carriers into a turn, to distract, to delay, to keep the Japanese pilots stuck on deck at the worst possible moment. A diversion. Nagamo realized it instantly. He turned to his chief of staff, voice trembling. They're sacrificing themselves to pin our ships in place. The officer said nothing. There was nothing to say. Below deck, Japanese pilots waited in their Zero fighters, strapped in, fuel tanks full, bombs loaded. But they couldn't take off. The deck crews were torn between rearming bombers and defending against torpedo attacks. Everything was tangled, chaotic, dangerous. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck. Bombs were stacked, unsecured. A single spark could turn everything into a floating inferno. A young Japanese pilot looked up through the cockpit glass at the sky. He saw American planes falling, burning, breaking apart, crashing into the sea. He whispered, "Why won't they stop?" Because they weren't meant to survive. Because something deadlier was coming behind them. On the horizon, a second formation appeared, tiny glints at first, growing larger as they dove from the upper atmosphere. American dive bombers, the deadliest killers in the Pacific. From the command deck, Lieutenant Kaku's voice cracked. "Admiral, this is the real attack," but it was already too late. The Zero fighters were still low. The flight decks were still crowded with fueled planes. And every Japanese carrier was turning sharply to dodge torpedoes, the exact maneuver that made them helpless to a dive-bombing strike. Nagamo clenched the railing as the sky above Akagi filled with screaming engines. The American planes folded their wings inward and plummeted straight down, sun flashing on their canopies, dive brakes shrieking. One Japanese sailor looked up and whispered, "God, protect us." The first bomb released. Then another, then 10 more. Their shadows fell across the carrier deck like claws. Nagamo shut his eyes. The trap wasn't closing. It had already closed. And now the killing blow was coming. The first bomb hit Kaga, not Akagi. A blinding flash erupted across her flight deck. Then a pillar of fire shot upward, turning steel beams into burning shrapnel. The explosion was so violent, it could be seen from miles away. Every man aboard Akagi felt it like a punch to the chest. Nagamo stared at the fireball rising from the sister carrier and whispered, "Kaga has been struck." But before anyone could react, an officer yelled, "More incoming! Above us!" The American dive bombers weren't attacking one ship. They were dividing, choosing targets. Each carrier marked for death. A second group peeled off, diving toward Soryu. Japanese gunners fired wildly, filling the sky with black bursts of smoke. But the dive bombers fell faster, cutting through the flak like it wasn't even there. On Soryu, a mechanic looked up just as the bomb fell. He barely had time to scream. The explosion ripped open the forward deck. Flames shot through the hangars where fully fueled aircraft were packed wing to wing. The fire spread instantly, like a monster unleashed. Within seconds, the deck was an inferno. The ship-as captain grabbed a railing to steady himself as shockwaves rippled through the metal beneath him. "We've lost the hangar. We've lost everything." Back on Akagi, the crew watched in horror as both carriers burned. But their terror turned to paralysis when a young signalman shrieked, "They're coming for us now." Nagamo stepped forward, gripping his binoculars. Through the smoke and fire, he saw them, a full squadron of dauntless dive bombers circling like hawks over a wounded animal. They selected Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese First Air Fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the heart of the entire operation. Dive brakes extended, wings tilted. The planes rolled over and dropped. One sailor on deck couldn't breathe. He watched as the American bombers screamed downward, growing larger, louder, deadlier every second. The deck crew tried to run, to hide, to take cover. But the deck was covered with bombs, torpedoes, fuel hoses, and disassembled planes. A nightmare waiting to ignite. The first American pilot lined up the red circle on the carrier deck in his sights. He whispered one word, "Now." The bomb released. It spun through the air, trailing thin smoke, falling straight toward the crowded flight deck. Nagamo's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't give an order. There was nothing left to order. He just whispered, "Akagi, forgive me." The bomb struck the deck, and the world turned white. A shock wave blew through the ship, shattering glass, flipping sailors into the air like rag dolls. Fire rushed through the hangars, detonating bombs, igniting fuel, transforming the carrier into a roaring volcanic eruption of steel and flame. Men screamed for help as smoke consumed the corridors. Officers were thrown to the ground, choking, blinded. The ship listed violently to one side. Above the chaos, American dive bombers pulled up, engines roaring as they climbed back into the sky. The Admirals' flagship, the strongest carrier Japan had ever built, was dying, and Nagamon knew it. He held the railing with shaking hands and whispered, "So this is how our empire falls." But the nightmare wasn't over, because far to the north, another Japanese carrier was about to be found. As Akagi burned, thick columns of black smoke curled into the sky, drifting across the ocean like a funeral shroud. Sailors abandoned hoses, abandoned guns, abandoned orders, because there was nothing left to save. The flagship was finished. But Japan still had one carrier untouched, Hiryu, farther north, separated from the other ships. Hiryu sailed through calm waters, its crew unaware of the total disaster unfolding beyond the horizon. On her bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi stared at the sky, listening to distant booms echoing across the sea. He didn't need radio reports. He knew the sound of dying ships. He whispered, almost to himself, "Kaga, Soryu, Akagi, they are gone." His officers stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, how can you be certain?" But Yamaguchi didn't answer. He looked eastward, toward the rising smoke far away. Then a messenger ran in, face ghost white. "Admiral, signals from command ships. All three carriers are burning." The room fell silent. Hiryu was alone. Yamaguchi exhaled slowly, then spoke with a calmness that terrified his officers more than shouting ever could. "Prepare aircraft for launch. We will strike back." Within minutes, Zero fighters and dive bombers were loaded, engines rumbling like caged beasts ready to be released. A pilot climbed into his cockpit and asked quietly, "Who will we be attacking, sir?" Yamaguchi didn't hesitate. "American carriers. They are out there. Find them." As Hiryu's planes took off, their shadows skimmed the water and then lifted into the sky, Japan's final hope rising into the clouds. Back near Midway, American carriers Enterprise and Yorktown sailed in tight formation, their decks swarming with crews preparing for the next wave. The Americans had struck first, but they knew the Japanese wouldn't die quietly. They were waiting for retaliation. A radar operator aboard Yorktown suddenly shouted, "Contact!" "Multiple bogies inbound," American commanders stiffened. "That must be Hiryu," one said. It was. Yamaguchi's pilots descended like a blade falling from the heavens, bombs armed, guns loaded, their vengeance for the destruction of the fleet burning hotter than the fires consuming Akagi. They dove straight for Yorktown. American fighters scrambled to intercept, twisting through the sky in a violent aerial ballet, engines screaming, bullets tearing through clouds. A Japanese bomber burst into flames and spiraled into the ocean. Another was blown apart midair. But they kept coming, relentless, unstoppable. One pilot broke through the defensive screen. He locked onto the flight deck. Smoke trailed from his wings. Blood dripped from his forehead. He muttered. For the fleet, he released his bomb at point-blank range. The explosion rocked Yorktown from bow to stern. Hatches blew open. Crewmen were thrown off their feet. Smoke churned across the deck like a living creature. Another bomb hit. And then a torpedo. Water flooded the lower decks. Damaged crews fought desperately to save the ship, but Yorktown was dying. On Hiryu, the radio crackled. Direct hit on enemy carrier. Heavy damage. For the first time all day, a cheer rose from Japanese sailors. Maybe, just maybe, the battle could still be turned. But the celebration didn't last long. Because even as they rejoiced, a lookout screamed, "Aircraft approaching! High altitude! Many!" Yamaguchi's head snapped upward. He knew instantly. The Americans have found Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, the last hope of the fleet. And they were coming. The sky above Hiryu began to darken, not with clouds, not with smoke, but with shadows, American dive bombers. Dozens of them, flying in perfect formation, silent, descending like a judgment Japan could no longer escape. A sailor on Hiryu stared upward, jaw trembling. These are the same planes that destroyed the others, he whispered. He wasn't wrong. They were the same killers who had burned Akagi, shattered Kaga, and gutted Soryu. And now, they were coming for the last one. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge, arms behind his back, eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. There was no fear in his face, only understanding. He turned to his captain and said quietly, "This is the moment we must face. Prepare to maneuver." But maneuvering meant nothing now. The dive bombers rolled over, noses down, dive breaks open, and fell like stones from heaven. Sirens screamed across Hiryu. Gunners scrambled to their stations. Bullets tore into the sky, but the Americans kept falling, closer, closer, closer. The first bomb hit the forward deck. A fireball erupted upward, tearing a hole through the steel like it was paper. Men were thrown into the air. Fuel lines ruptured. Flames roared through the hangars. Before the shock wave even faded, the second bomb struck. This one hit deeper right into the heart of the ship. The lights flickered. Metal groaned. Explosions chained together like thunder rolling across the ocean. Yamaguchi grabbed the railing as the deck shook beneath him. Smoke filled the bridge. Officers coughed, covering their mouths, but the admiral stood tall. The third bomb screamed down. Every man on Hiryu knew it was over. The blast tore apart the rear deck, flipping planes, igniting ammunition, sending a column of flame hundreds of feet into the sky. The ship listed sharply. Alarms wailed, echoing through flooding corridors. Sailors rushed to help wounded comrades, pulling them through fire and debris. On the bridge, the captain turned to Yamaguchi, voice breaking. "Admiral, the ship cannot be saved." Yamaguchi closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he saw Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, the proud carriers of Japan's might burning in the distance. He saw the Empire's ambitions collapsing in fire. Then he opened his eyes and said calmly, "Order the crew to abandon ship." The captain hesitated. "And you, sir?" Yamaguchi smiled faintly. "I will remain with Hiryu. A commander does not leave his ship while it still breathes." The captain's eyes filled with tears as he saluted one final time and ran to evacuate the crew. Yamaguchi stepped onto the open deck. Flames roared around him, embers drifting like dying stars. The ocean glowed orange from the inferno, devouring the carrier. He looked to the horizon toward the spot where the other Japanese carriers had died. He whispered, "Fight on. Even without us." With a final thunderous explosion, Hiryu's engines collapsed inward. The ship shuddered, groaned, and began sinking into the Pacific. From the American carriers, pilots flying home watched a plume of fire rise into the sky. One of them spoke softly into his radio. "That's the last one. The Japanese fleet is finished." He was right. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 4 irreplaceable air fleets, 4 pillars of their naval power. And when Japanese high command received the news that night, they didn't speak for a long time, because they understood something deeper, darker, final. The war had just changed. Forever. Midway wasn't a battle. It was a turning point. And the moment the admirals realized it was a trap, their reaction said everything.